The Chateau Margaux splashed across Terry's face before the room could even gasp. The $2,000 bottle of wine, deep crimson, aged to perfection, dripped from her silver evening gown onto the marble floor of the Henderson Grand Ballroom, staining the hem of a dress that cost more than Dennis's monthly rent. But he didn't know that yet. For 3 seconds, the entire charity gala froze. 200 of Manhattan's elite, mid-conversation, mid-champagne sip, mid-laughter, all turned to witness the spectacle. Terry stood there, wine streaming down her cheeks like tears she refused to cry anymore, looking up at the man who'd shattered her world 5 years ago. Dennis Carmichael, her ex-boyfriend, the man who'd called her just a waitress when he left her for someone with a better pedigree. The man who'd told her she'd never amount to anything, that girls from the South Side didn't belong in places like this. The man who was now sneering down at her with that same superior smirk, his voice dripping with mockery. "Oops," he drawled, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Guess you still haven't learned to stay out of places you don't belong. What are you doing here anyway, working the coat check?" He had no idea who she was anymore. No idea that the broken waitress he remembered. The one who'd worked double shifts at that downtown diner, who'd cried herself to sleep in her studio apartment, who'd eaten ramen for weeks to afford a single nice dress for his company party only to be told to stay home, was gone. Vanished like smoke. No idea about the 6-carat emerald-cut diamond hidden beneath her wine-soaked glove. No idea about the penthouse overlooking Central Park she'd left 2 hours ago. No idea about the private car waiting outside, or the foundation bearing her new name that was hosting this very gala. And Dennis definitely had no idea about the man whose last name she now carried. The man whose security detail was stationed at every exit. The man whose phone was vibrating in her crystal clutch right this second. Matthew Harrington, her husband. CEO of Harrington Industries, Forbes billionaire, and the most powerful man in this room. As Terry's steady fingers reached into her purse, ignoring the gasps, ignoring the phones being raised to record, ignoring Dennis's cruel laughter, she heard the unmistakable sound of Matthew's footsteps cutting through the crowd. Sharp, precise, furious. She watched the color start to drain from Dennis's face as he followed everyone's gaze to the man approaching. The man whose name was on the building. The man whose charity event this was. The man whose wife Dennis had just humiliated. Dennis just poured wine on the wrong woman. And in approximately 45 seconds, when Matthew reached this spot and the head of security pulled up Dennis's background check on the tablet already in his hand, Dennis Carmichael was going to learn that some waitresses marry kings. That some women you underestimate become queens. That some mistakes you make will cost you everything. But he didn't know it yet. Right now, in this moment frozen in time, he still thought she was nothing. That was about to change forever. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The rain had been relentless that night 5 years ago, turning the broken asphalt into mirrors that reflected Terry's tears back at her. She stood at the bus stop on 7th Avenue, clutching a black trash bag that held everything Dennis thought she was worth. Her uniform from Marcello's Bistro, 2 pairs of non-slip shoes, and the apron she'd worn the night they met. The night he'd ordered the lobster risotto and left her a $100 tip with his phone number. "I need someone with ambition, Terry," Dennis had said from the driver's seat of his leased BMW, engine running, windshield wipers cutting through the downpour. "Someone who fits into my world. You're a waitress. That's all you'll ever be." She'd tried to speak, tried to tell him about the night classes she was taking, about the business plan she'd been writing in the margins of her order pad, about the dreams she had that stretched far beyond the bistro's kitchen doors. But he'd already rolled up the window. Already pulled away. Already decided her worth. The trash bag had split open when the bus finally arrived, spilling her life across the wet pavement. She'd gathered it all with shaking hands while other passengers stepped around her, their umbrellas creating a canopy of indifference above her head. That was the last time Terry had cried over Dennis Carmichael. That was the night she'd decided that the only person who could define her worth was herself. "You don't have to go if you're not ready," Matthew said, his reflection appearing beside hers in the full-length mirror of their bedroom. He adjusted his bow tie, but his eyes never left her face, reading the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers worried the clasp of her diamond bracelet. Terry studied herself in the mirror. The silver Valentino gown hugged her curves like liquid moonlight, the slit revealing just enough leg to be elegant rather than provocative. Her hair was swept up in a style that exposed the graceful column of her neck, where a necklace Matthew had given her for their first anniversary caught the light. Emeralds surrounded by diamonds, a constellation of green fire against her brown skin. "I'm ready," she said, but her voice wavered. Matthew turned her gently to face him, his hands warm on her bare shoulders. At 42, he carried his success with the quiet confidence of a man who'd built empires rather than inherited them. Silver threaded through his dark hair, and the lines around his eyes spoke of someone who smiled often, who led with integrity, who loved fiercely. "Terry, listen to me." His voice was soft but firm. "You're not attending as my plus one. You're not my accessory or my shadow. You're my wife, yes, but you're also the woman who turned a single food truck into a restaurant chain. The woman whose foundation has fed 20,000 homeless families this year. The woman who sits on 3 corporate boards and makes venture capitalists nervous with how smart you are. Matthew, you belong in that ballroom more than half the people who'll be there. Not because you're married to me. Because of who you are." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "But if Dennis Carmichael is there, if seeing him is too much, we leave. No questions asked. Your peace matters more than any charity event." Terry took a breath, feeling the corset of old shame loosen just slightly. "He doesn't get to take any more rooms from me. I've spent 5 years avoiding places I thought he might be. I'm done being small." Matthew smiled, pride gleaming in his eyes. "Then let's go show Manhattan what a queen looks like." The Henderson Grand Ballroom was a cathedral of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks from the vaulted ceiling, each one casting prisms of light across the crowd below. The New York Philharmonic played softly in the corner, their music weaving through conversations about mergers and acquisitions, summer homes in the Hamptons, and whose daughter had gotten into which Ivy League school. Terry entered on Matthew's arm, her head high, her smile practiced but genuine. She'd learned in the past 3 years of marriage how to navigate these spaces, how to make small talk with old money and new tech, how to be gracious when someone asked, "And what do you do?" with that particular tone that expected the answer to be, "I shop and plan parties." She'd made it halfway through her first glass of champagne when she felt it. That prickling awareness, that sixth sense that tells you when you're being watched. She turned, scanning the crowd, and there he was. Dennis Carmichael stood near the silent auction table, his hand resting possessively on the waist of a blonde woman draped in Chanel. He looked successful in the way men do when they're trying too hard, the watch too flashy, the tan too even, the smile too white. But his eyes found Terry across the room, and for a moment, she saw recognition flicker across his face, followed immediately by confusion. She looked different. Of course she looked different. The Terry he'd abandoned at that bus stop had worn discount store dresses and drugstore makeup. She'd cut her own hair and carried purses with broken zippers. This Terry, the real Terry who'd finally had the resources to become her fullest self, was ethereal. Untouchable. A woman who belonged exactly where she stood. Dennis's eyes narrowed. She watched him lean down to whisper something to the blonde, who glanced over and giggled behind her champagne flute. Then he straightened, excused himself, and began cutting through the crowd. Coming toward her, Matthew had been pulled into a conversation with the mayor, his hand on Terry's lower back even as he discussed tax incentives and infrastructure. She could interrupt, could pull him away, could use him as a shield. But something in her refused. She'd spent 5 years building herself into someone who didn't need shields. "I'll be right back," she murmured to Matthew, squeezing his hand once before stepping away. She moved toward the bar, needing a moment, needing space. The bartender smiled at her, already reaching for the top-shelf vodka she'd ordered earlier. But before he could pour, a voice cut through the air beside her. Well, Terry Washington, or should I say Terry? What was it, Mitchell? Morrison?" She turned slowly, deliberately, letting him see the full effect of her transformation. "Harrington," she said coolly. "Terry Harrington." Dennis's laugh was sharp, disbelieving. Harrington? You married some guy named Harrington? He leaned against the bar, his cologne too strong, his smile too cruel. Let me guess, middle management? Insurance? You always did aim low. Something like that, Terry said, her voice neutral. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of correction, wouldn't play into whatever game he was running. I have to say, I'm surprised to see you here. Dennis gestured at the ballroom with his whiskey glass. This isn't really your kind of crowd, is it? I mean, unless you're working the event. That would make more sense. His eyes traveled down her dress, assessment sharp as a blade. Nice dress, by the way. Rental? No. He reached out suddenly, his fingers catching her wrist before she could pull away, lifting her hand to examine her engagement ring in the light. This can't be real. I mean, what kind of guy gives his wife a cubic zirconia this size? That's just embarrassing. Terry pulled her hand back, her heart pounding but her face calm. If you'll excuse me, those earrings, too. Dennis was warming to his theme now, his voice rising just enough for nearby guests to glance over. The necklace. All fake, right? I know you, Terry. You could never afford the real thing. Hell, you could barely afford rent when we were together. I used to have to spot you grocery money. That was a lie. She'd never asked him for a dime. But Terry knew what he was doing, rewriting history, making himself the generous benefactor and her the desperate charity case. It was what cruel men did when their egos needed feeding. Dennis, I think you've had too much to drink. She tried to step around him, but he moved to block her path. I'm just trying to help you out, he said, his tone shifting to something that might have passed for concern if not for the malice in his eyes. You're clearly trying to play dress up, trying to fit in where you don't belong. Someone should tell you the truth. Someone should remind you what you really are. The bartender had stopped pouring drinks. A woman in a red gown had her phone out, angled toward them. The music seemed to fade, or maybe that was just the blood rushing in Terry's ears. And what am I, Dennis? She heard herself ask, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. He smiled then, a terrible smile that she remembered from that night at the bus stop. The smile of a man who believed he had the power to define someone else's reality. You're a waitress, he said simply. That's all you've ever been. All you'll ever be. You can put on a fancy dress and crash a party like this, but everyone can see through it. Everyone knows you don't belong. I'm not crashing, Terry said quietly. I was invited. Right. Dennis laughed, loud enough now that a small crowd was forming, drawn by the spectacle. Sure you were. Let me guess. You're someone's plus one? Whose date are you, Terry? Which lonely businessman hired you for the evening? The gasps from the onlookers were audible. Terry felt the heat of humiliation rising up her neck, the old shame threatening to swallow her whole. This was the Dennis she remembered. The one who knew exactly how to find your softest, most vulnerable places and press down until you broke. But she wasn't the same woman he'd left at that bus stop. She'd been forged in the fire of her own determination. She'd built herself from nothing into something extraordinary. And she refused to let him make her feel small again. I think you should leave, she said, her voice low but clear. Leave? Dennis set his whiskey down on the bar with a sharp crack. I paid $2,000 a plate to be here. I'm a sponsor. You're the one who should leave before security realizes you snuck in. He reached for something then. She saw his hand moving, saw the bartender's eyes go wide, and suddenly he had a bottle of wine. One of the expensive bottles from the charity auction, deep red and full. You know what, Dennis said, his voice taking on that performative quality of men who are used to being the center of attention. I think you're confused about what kind of event this is. So let me clear things up for you. He tilted the bottle, and Terry understood what was happening a full second before the wine began to pour. She could have stepped back, could have moved, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Some part of her that needed to see exactly how far he would go. Some part of her that needed witnesses to his cruelty. The Chateau Margaux, $2,000 a bottle, aged 20 years, meant to be savored, cascaded over her head. It soaked through her carefully styled hair, ran down her face like blood, drenched the silver Valentino gown that had taken 3 fittings to perfect. She felt it seeping through the delicate fabric, cold against her skin, pooling in her shoes. The ballroom went silent. Completely, absolutely silent. There, Dennis said, setting the empty bottle down with a satisfied thunk. Consider that your tip, for your service. Because that's what you are, right? The hired help? And the help should know their place. Terry stood perfectly still, wine dripping from her chin, from her fingertips, from the hem of her dress. She looked at Dennis, at his triumphant smile, at the way he'd already turned to play to his audience, expecting laughter, expecting approval for putting an uppity waitress back in her place. But no one was laughing. The crowd had gone from curious to horrified, phones raised not in amusement but in documentation. The woman in the red dress had her hand over her mouth. The bartender had already signaled to security. And then she heard them. Those footsteps she'd recognize anywhere. Sharp, precise, furious. The crowd parted like water as Matthew Harrington cut through them, his face a mask of controlled rage that made grown men step back. His security chief, Marcus, was at his side, tablet already in hand. 2 security guards flanked them, hands near their earpieces. Dennis was still basking in his perceived victory when Matthew reached them. Still smiling, still utterly, completely unaware of what was about to happen. "Terry," Matthew said, his voice deadly quiet as he reached his wife. He didn't touch her, didn't try to wipe the wine away. He simply stood beside her, his presence a declaration and a promise. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'm okay." Only then did Matthew turn to Dennis, and Terry watched the exact moment Dennis recognized him. Watched the color drain from his face. Watched his smile collapse like a building in demolition. "Do you know who I am?" Matthew asked, his tone conversational. Dennis's mouth opened and closed. "Mr. Harrington, I didn't. I'm going to answer my own question since you seem to be struggling." Matthew took a single step closer, and Dennis backed up against the bar. "I'm Matthew Harrington. This is my charity event. This is my ballroom. Those are my guests you just embarrassed yourself in front of. And most importantly," his voice dropped to something cold and lethal, "that is my wife you just assaulted." "Your wife?" Dennis's voice cracked. "No, that's Terry. She's just a..." "Finish that sentence," Matthew said softly. "Please, I want to hear you finish that sentence." Dennis's blonde date had materialized at his elbow, pulling at his arm. "Dennis, we should go. We should go right now." But it was too late. Marcus had his tablet up, reading from it in a clear voice that carried across the silent ballroom. Dennis Carmichael, currently employed as a senior financial analyst at Westbridge Capital Management. Salary: $180,000 annually. Previous employment includes 3 positions, terminated from 2 for embezzlement allegations that were settled out of court. Current debts total just over $300,000, including the BMW lease that's 3 months overdue. Dennis had gone from pale to gray. "How did you can't. You poured a $2,000 bottle of wine on my wife," Matthew said, his voice cutting through Dennis's stammering. "You called her the help. You told her she doesn't belong in a room that bears my family's name on the wall. Did you really think I wouldn't find out exactly who you are?" "It was a joke," Dennis tried, his voice desperate now. "Just a misunderstanding. We used to date, and I didn't realize I didn't know she was." "You didn't know she was a person deserving of basic human dignity?" Matthew's words were sharp as glass. "Or you didn't know she was someone important enough to warrant your respect?" Terry reached out, her wine-soaked hand finding Matthew's. "Matthew," she said softly. He looked at her, and some of the fury in his eyes softened. "What do you need?" "I need him to know something." She turned to Dennis, who looked like he might be sick. "I want him to understand what he did wrong. And it's not that he poured wine on Matthew Harrington's wife. It's that he poured wine on a human being. That he thought he had the right to humiliate someone because he'd decided they were beneath him." She stepped forward, wine still dripping, but standing tall, standing proud. "You told me I was just a waitress, Dennis. Like that was the worst thing a person could be. Like serving people food was shameful. Like working hard at an honest job meant I deserved to be treated like garbage. Terry, I'm sorry, I'm not finished." Her voice carried now, strong and clear. "I was a waitress. A damn good one. I worked 60-hour weeks and smiled through harassment and aching feet because I was building something. Because I had dreams bigger than you could see. And when I finally had the chance to chase those dreams, you know what the hardest part was? It wasn't the business plan or the investors or the long nights. It was unlearning the shame you made me feel about where I came from. The crowd was absolutely riveted. Phones were still recording, but now they were documenting something else. Something true. I built a restaurant empire from a single food truck, Terry continued. I started a foundation that feeds thousands. I sit on boards and make decisions that affect people's lives. But you know what I'm most proud of? I'm still kind to waiters. I still tip well. I still treat service workers like the valuable, essential, dignified human beings they are. Because I remember what it's like to be seen as less than human by people like you. Dennis was crying now, actual tears streaming down his face. His date had already slipped away into the crowd. Around them, Terry could hear murmurs of approval, could see people nodding. Matthew spoke into his phone briefly, then looked at Dennis with cold finality. Mr. Carmichael, I've just spoken with the managing partner at Westbridge Capital Management. He's a personal friend. He's also appalled by your behavior this evening. You'll find your keycard deactivated by morning. No, please, you can't, my job. Should have thought of that before you decided to humiliate someone at a charity event. Matthew's tone was absolute. Marcus, please escort Mr. Carmichael out. Make sure every person on the guest list knows why he's being removed. I want there to be no confusion about what happens when someone disrespects my wife. Security moved in, each taking one of Dennis's arms. He looked at Terry one last time, his face crumpling. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. Terry met his eyes, and in that moment, she felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just peace. The ghost that had haunted her for 5 years was just a man. A small, insecure man who'd needed to tear others down to feel big. He couldn't hurt her anymore. He'd never been able to hurt her, she'd just given him permission to. I forgive you, she said quietly. Not for you. For me. Because I'm done carrying you around. As security led Dennis away, the ballroom erupted into applause. Not polite charity event applause, but real, genuine applause. People crowded around Terry, offering napkins, offering jackets, offering words of support. Matthew wrapped his tuxedo jacket around her shoulders, pulling her close. Let's go home, he murmured against her hair. Not yet, Terry said, surprising herself. She looked around the ballroom, at all these powerful people who'd witnessed her humiliation and her triumph. I came here to attend a charity event. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. Matthew's smile was brilliant. That's my girl. Terry Harrington spent the rest of the evening soaked in wine, holding court like a queen. She bid on auction items. She danced with her husband. She told her story to anyone who asked, leaving out nothing, ashamed of nothing. And when she finally went home that night, her dress ruined but her spirit soaring, she threw away the last pieces of the girl who'd stood at that bus stop clutching a trash bag. She was done being defined by the men who'd underestimated her. Done being small. Done being anything less than exactly who she'd fought to become. She was Terry Harrington. She was a waitress and a CEO and a wife and a philanthropist and a woman who'd turned her pain into power. And she belonged anywhere she damn well pleased. The applause faded, but the whispers didn't. Terry stood in Matthew's tuxedo jacket, wine still dripping from her hair, and watched the crowd's energy shift like a tide turning. What had been shock was curdling into something else. Something uglier. Did you see her face? A woman in diamonds leaned toward her companion, her voice just loud enough to carry. She didn't even try to defend herself. Probably because he's right. I heard she crashed the event, another voice added. Someone said she was caught trying to steal champagne from the service area earlier. Terry's stomach clenched. This was how it happened. How a narrative took root. Dennis had planted the seed, she doesn't belong here, and now people were watering it with their own assumptions and prejudices. Poor Matthew Harrington, a man in a gray suit said, shaking his head. Seems like a good guy. Probably got taken in by a gold digger. You know how these women operate. Matthew's hand tightened on Terry's waist, his jaw setting like concrete. She could feel the fury radiating off him in waves. "Matthew, don't," she whispered. "It's not worth it. They're talking about my wife like she's—" "Let them." Terry lifted her chin, even as shame burned through her chest. "Their opinions don't define me." But it was getting harder to believe that. The crowd had formed a kind of loose circle around them, phones still out, but now the recording felt less like documentation and more like spectacle. Like they were waiting for her to break. To prove Dennis right. To show them all that she was exactly what they suspected, an imposter in a borrowed dress. A woman Terry recognized from the symphony board, Victoria something, old money, older opinions. Approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "My dear, are you all right? That was quite a scene. I'm sure you're terribly embarrassed." "I'm fine, thank you," Terry said evenly. "Of course you are. You know," Victoria's voice dropped to a stage whisper. "These things happen when people don't understand the social conventions of events like these. No judgment, of course, but perhaps you might be more comfortable at a different kind of gathering? Something less formal?" The condescension was wrapped in silk, but it was condescension nonetheless. Terry felt Matthew tense beside her, felt him drawing breath to speak, but someone else got there first. "I mean, look at her jewelry, a young socialite, couldn't be more than 25, trust fund written all over her," said to her friends, not even bothering to lower her voice. "It's so obviously fake, like shopping channel quality. My cleaning lady has better pieces." Laughter rippled through the group. Terry's hand went unconsciously to her necklace, the emeralds that Matthew had selected personally from Cartier, the diamonds that had required their own insurance policy. She wanted to scream the truth at them, wanted to shove the certificates of authenticity in their smug faces. But what would that prove? That she deserved respect because she had money? That she belonged because she could afford the price of admission? "Matthew, I want to go," she said quietly. Her voice didn't shake, but it was close. "Terry. Please. I don't want to be here anymore." She was trying to hold onto her dignity, trying to channel the woman who'd stood tall just moments ago and forgiven Dennis, but the walls were closing in. The whispers were getting louder. Someone laughed. Someone pointed. And Terry felt herself shrinking, felt that old shame crawling up from the place where she thought she'd buried it. Matthew pulled her closer, his voice fierce in her ear. "Listen to me. We're not running. We're not giving these people the satisfaction of watching you flee. We're going to wait exactly 3 more minutes, and then we're going to leave on our terms, not theirs." "Why 3 minutes?" Before he could answer, the energy in the room shifted again. Violently. Like a record scratch in the middle of a song. The conversation stopped mid-sentence. People turned toward the ballroom's main entrance, their expressions changing from mockery to something else. Something like fear. Terry followed their gazes and saw him. Matthew C. Boyette stood in the doorway, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He was taller than she'd remembered from the photos, his presence filling the space in a way that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with raw power. At 49, he carried himself like a man who'd built his empire through will and strategic brilliance, who'd turned a failing manufacturing company into a multinational conglomerate worth $30 billion. His tuxedo was impeccable, Tom Ford, custom-tailored, probably cost more than a used car. But it was his face that held Terry's attention. The sharp angles, the steel-gray eyes that swept the room like a security camera. The expression of a man who'd just walked into a situation he didn't like and was about to correct with extreme prejudice. He took 3 steps into the ballroom, and people scattered out of his path like he was radioactive. His eyes found Matthew first, Matthew Harrington, his chief financial officer, the man he'd personally recruited from Goldman Sachs 3 years ago. Then his gaze shifted to the woman beside Matthew. The woman wearing Matthew's tuxedo jacket, the woman with wine still dripping from her hair and dress. His wife. The silence was so complete Terry could hear her own heartbeat. Could hear the crystal chandeliers chiming softly in the air conditioning. Could hear someone's phone clatter to the floor as its owner's hands went slack with shock. Matthew C. Boyette. Called MC by his friends, called Mr. Boyette by everyone else, called "that ruthless bastard" by his competitors, crossed the ballroom in long, purposeful strides. His security detail materialized from the periphery, 4 men in dark suits who positioned themselves strategically around the room. He reached them, his eyes traveling over Terry's ruined dress, her wine-soaked hair, the mascara she could feel running down her cheeks. Something dark and dangerous flickered across his face. Who did this? His voice was quiet, deadly quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded devastating action. Matthew Harrington spoke quickly. Sir, there was an incident. A guest, Dennis Carmichael, he assaulted Mrs. Boyette. I've already had him removed from the premises and terminated his business relationship with. Where is he? Security has him in the service corridor. I was waiting for your instruction on whether to involve the police. MC's jaw tightened. We'll get to him. First, he turned his attention fully to Terry, and his expression softened into something that looked almost like gentleness. Terry, are you hurt? Did he touch you beyond pouring the wine? Terry found her voice, though it came out smaller than she wanted. No, Mr. Boyette, I'm fine. It was just embarrassing. Embarrassing, he repeated, tasting the word like it was poison. He looked around the ballroom, at the frozen crowd, at the phone still recording. I see. And did anyone help my wife when this happened? Did anyone offer her assistance? Did anyone, his voice rose slightly, defend her? The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Victoria from the symphony board suddenly found her champagne glass fascinating. The trust fund socialite who'd mocked Terry's jewelry had gone pale. That's what I thought. MC turned back to Matthew Harrington. Matthew, thank you for protecting Terry. I knew I could count on you. I'll handle things from here. Then he did something that sent a collective gasp through the room. He removed his own tuxedo jacket and draped it over Terry's shoulders, on top of Matthew Harrington's. He took her hand, the one with the emerald ring, and raised it so the light caught the stones. For those of you who don't know, he said, his voice projecting to every corner of the ballroom, this is my wife. Terry Boyette. Perhaps some of you thought the CFO's wife was named Terry. Perhaps some of you made assumptions. Let me clarify. He gestured to Matthew Harrington. This is Matthew Harrington, my chief financial officer and a trusted friend. This, he pulled Terry closer, is Teresa Marie Boyette, my wife of 3 years. The chairwoman of the Boyette Foundation. The woman who personally oversees a portfolio worth $800 million in charitable assets. The woman who sits on this company's board of directors and has veto power over any decision I make regarding corporate philanthropy. Terry watched the crowd's faces change as understanding crashed over them like a wave. Watched Victoria's mouth fall open. Watched the socialite who'd mocked her jewelry turn a shade of red that clashed with her gown. The necklace she's wearing, MC continued, his voice taking on an edge that could cut glass, is from Cartier's private collection. It cost more than most of you make in a year. Her dress is Valentino couture. Her shoes are custom Manolo Blahnik. But none of that matters because my wife would deserve your respect if she'd walked in here wearing clothes from Target and jewelry from a vending machine. He paused, letting that sink in. The fact that you didn't offer her that respect tells me everything I need to know about your character. A man in the crowd, someone Terry didn't recognize, cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Boyette, we didn't know. If we'd realized. Realized what? That she was important? That she was connected to power? That she mattered? MC's words were scalpel precise. She mattered before you knew who she was. She mattered when she was standing alone, covered in wine, being mocked by people who should have known better. The fact that you only care now that you know her last name is exactly the problem. Terry felt tears pricking her eyes, but they weren't tears of shame anymore. They were something else. Something like vindication. Like being seen. Like being defended by someone who understood that her worth wasn't conditional on her connections. MC turned to his security chief. Marcus, bring Dennis Carmichael back in here. I want to have a conversation with him. Sir, I don't think, Matthew Harrington started. It's not a request. 2 minutes later, security escorted Dennis back into the ballroom. He'd been crying, his face was blotchy, his eyes red. When he saw MC, he actually stumbled, his legs going weak. The guards had to hold him upright. Mr. Boyette, Dennis stammered. I swear I didn't know. Didn't know what? MC's voice was conversational, almost friendly. It was terrifying. Didn't know she was my wife? Or didn't know you shouldn't assault women at charity events? Both, I mean. MC reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sheaf of papers. Terry recognized them immediately. The business proposal Dennis had been shopping around, the one requesting a meeting with Boyette Industries to pitch some kind of financial services partnership. This is your proposal, correct? MC held up the papers. The one you've been emailing my office about for 6 weeks? The one you claimed would revolutionize our investment strategy. Dennis nodded, hope flickering in his eyes despite everything. Yes, sir. It's a solid opportunity. If you just look at the projections. MC looked at the proposal for a long moment. Then, with deliberate slowness, he tore it in half. Then in half again. And again. He let the pieces flutter to the marble floor like snow. That's what I think of your proposal, he said. That's what I think of doing business with a man who treats my wife, who treats any woman, the way you treated Terry tonight. Please, Dennis's voice cracked. I've already lost my job. Don't blacklist me. I'll never work in this city again if you. You're right, you won't. MC's words were final. Because I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are. Not because you insulted someone important, but because you're the kind of person who thinks it's acceptable to humiliate someone you perceive as beneath you. He pulled out his phone, typed something quickly, and hit send. I've just forwarded security footage of tonight's incident to every major business publication in New York, along with a statement. By tomorrow morning, your face will be on every business blog and news site, identified as the man who assaulted a woman at a charity event. Dennis collapsed to his knees. Actual knees. No, please, you're ruining my life. You ruined your own life, Terry said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was steady now, strong. The moment you decided my worth was something you had the right to determine. The moment you thought you could humiliate me without consequences. MC looked at her, a question in his eyes. She nodded. Get him out of here, MC told security. Permanently. Mr. Carmichael is banned from any property owned by Boyette Industries, any event we sponsor, and any establishment where we hold influence. Distribute his photo to security teams across the city. As they dragged Dennis away, still crying, still begging, MC turned to address the crowd one final time. Let me be very clear about something, he said. My wife is not important because she's married to me. She's not valuable because of her position or her wealth. She's remarkable because of who she is. Because she worked her way up from nothing, because she built something meaningful, because she treats people with dignity regardless of their station in life. He pulled Terry against his side. The fact that so many of you failed to see that, failed to offer basic human decency to someone in distress, tells me that perhaps I've been too generous with my charitable contributions to some of your organizations. My assistant will be reaching out to several of you to discuss the status of our ongoing partnerships. The crowd had gone from uncomfortable to panicked. Terry could see people mentally calculating which boards they served on, which foundations they represented, which organizations were about to lose Boyette funding. But that's a conversation for tomorrow, MC continued. Tonight, I'm going to take my wife home. Matthew, he nodded to his CFO, thank you for being there for her. Consider tomorrow a paid day off. You've earned it. Matthew Harrington smiled. It was my honor, sir. MC began to guide Terry toward the exit, but she stopped, turning back to face the ballroom one last time. She looked at Victoria, at the socialite, at all the people who'd whispered and judged and assumed. I was a waitress, she said clearly. I worked at Marcello's Bistro on 7th Avenue. I worked 60-hour weeks and my feet ached and sometimes customers yelled at me for things that weren't my fault. And you know what? I'm not ashamed of that. I'm proud of it. I'm proud that I know what it's like to work hard. I'm proud that I understand what it means to serve people. I'm proud that I don't look down on others because of their job or their background. She paused, letting her words sink in. I feel sorry for all of you. Because you'll never know the satisfaction of building something from nothing. You'll never understand what it means to be underestimated and prove everyone wrong. You'll only ever know what it's like to have power handed to you, and you don't even know how to wield it with grace. The silence that followed was absolute. MC's eyes shone with pride as he looked at his wife. Ready to go home, Mrs. Boyette? More than ready. They walked out of the Henderson Grand Ballroom together, leaving behind a crowd of people who would spend the rest of the night, and probably the rest of their lives, regretting how they'd treated a woman they'd assumed didn't matter. The private car was waiting outside, warm and quiet and blessedly free of judgment. Terry sank into the leather seats, suddenly exhausted. MC slid in beside her, immediately pulling her close. "I'm sorry I wasn't there sooner," he said quietly. "I got held up in traffic coming from the airport. If I'd known." "You couldn't have known." Terry rested her head on his shoulder, feeling safe for the first time all evening. "And Matthew took care of me. He was wonderful. I'll give him a raise." "You gave him a raise 3 months ago." "Then I'll give him another one." MC pressed a kiss to her wine-sticky hair, not caring about the mess. "I'm sorry you had to face Dennis. I'm sorry anyone made you feel less than the extraordinary woman you are." Terry was quiet for a moment, watching the city lights blur past the tinted windows. "You know what the strangest part is? I thought confronting Dennis would feel different. I thought I'd feel triumphant or vindicated or something big. But mostly I just feel tired." "That's because you already did the hard work," MC said. "Years ago, when you decided his opinion didn't define you. When you built yourself into someone remarkable. Tonight was just paperwork. Closing a chapter that was already finished." She smiled despite herself. "That's very philosophical for a ruthless CEO. I contain multitudes." He pulled back to look at her, his expression serious. "Terry, I need you to hear something. What happened tonight? The way those people treated you, that wasn't about you. That was about their own insecurities, their own prejudices, their own failures of character." "I know. Do you? Because I saw your face in there. I saw you starting to believe their narrative. Starting to shrink yourself down to fit their narrow definitions." Terry swallowed hard. "Old habits. Old fears. I know. But here's what I need you to remember, you're Terry Boyette. You turned a food truck into a restaurant empire. You run a foundation that changes lives. You sit on corporate boards and make venture capitalists nervous with how smart you are. You're kind to waiters and generous with your time, and you still remember what it's like to struggle, which makes you better than 90% of the people in that ballroom." "MC, I'm not finished." He cupped her face gently, his thumbs wiping away the mascara tracks on her cheeks. "You're also my wife, my partner, the person I chose to build a life with. And I would choose you again every single day, regardless of your bank account or your job title or your social status. I would choose you if you were still waiting tables at Marcello's. I would choose you if you'd never built a business. Because who you are, your heart, your resilience, your grace, that's what matters." Terry felt tears spilling over, but they were good tears. Healing tears. "I love you. I love you too. Now let's go home, get you in a bath, and burn that dress in the fireplace. It's Valentino. I'll buy you 10 more. He grinned. "I'm a billionaire. It's what we do." As the car pulled up to their building, a penthouse overlooking Central Park, all glass and light and space, Terry looked back one last time in the direction of the Henderson Grand Ballroom. Somewhere in that building, Dennis Carmichael was being escorted out by security, his career in tatters, his reputation destroyed, his life fundamentally altered by his own cruelty. Somewhere in that building, socialites were panicking about losing Boyette funding, about being associated with the incident, about damage control. And somewhere in that building, hopefully, at least one person was thinking about how they'd failed to show basic human decency to someone who needed it. Terry hoped they felt the weight of that failure. Hoped it changed them. But whether it did or not, she was done carrying their shame. Done carrying Dennis's shame. Done carrying the shame of every person who'd ever made her feel small. She was Terry Boyette. She belonged anywhere she chose to be. And anyone who couldn't see her worth wasn't worthy of her time. MC helped her out of the car, his hand steady in hers. "What are you thinking about?" Terry looked up at their building, at the home they'd built together, at the life that stretched out before them full of possibility and promise. She thought about the food truck she'd bought with her last $5. Somewhere in that building, Dennis Carmichael was being escorted out by security, his career in tatters, his reputation destroyed, his life fundamentally altered by his own cruelty. Somewhere in that building, socialites were panicking about losing Boyette funding, about being associated with the incident, about damage control. And somewhere in that building, hopefully, At least one person was thinking about how they'd failed to show basic human decency to someone who needed it. Terry hoped they felt the weight of that failure. Hoped it changed them. But whether it did or not, she was done carrying their shame. Done carrying Dennis's shame. Done carrying the shame of every person who'd ever made her feel small. She was Terry Boyette. She belonged anywhere she chose to be. And anyone who couldn't see her worth wasn't worthy of her time. MC helped her out of the car, his hand steady in hers. "What are you thinking about?" Terry looked up at their building, at the home they'd built together, at the life that stretched out before them full of possibility and promise. She thought about the food truck she'd bought with her last $5,000. She thought about the restaurant that now had 12 locations. She thought about the foundation that fed thousands. She thought about every step of the journey that had brought her here. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "Damn right you are." They walked into the building together, leaving the night behind them. Leaving Dennis behind. Leaving all of it behind. Because Terry Boyette was done looking back. She was done being defined by the people who'd underestimated her. She was too busy building a future to waste any more time on the past. And as she stepped into the elevator, her hand in her husband's, her head held high despite the wine-stained dress, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Complete, absolute, unshakable peace. She was enough. She had always been enough. And she always would be. The elevator doors closed, and Terry Boyette ascended, leaving behind the ghosts of who she used to be and rising toward the woman she'd fought so hard to become.